As Cheech Marin said in Ghostbusters 2, well, better late than never. First of all, my apologies for the delay in getting this video published. In fact, my apologies also for it having been a while since I've made any videos at all. The channel is not dead, I've just been stupid busy with a bunch of projects. One of my jobs is tutoring high school students, and the SATs were this week, so the day job has been keeping me busier than usual these last couple of weeks. Couple that with the fact that my master's thesis ended up being over 350 pages long, all of which I wrote in the space of about a month, along with all the normal day-to-day business, and it frankly just took me longer than expected to finish watching all of the movies, and then to compile my notes and film this video. So, my apologies, but if the gods are smiling on me, I should be getting back to a more normal filming schedule now. Though, on the other hand, now I need to revise said thesis, edit an anthology, build some non-horror related woodworking projects, and God knows what else. So it's still going to be a bit of a struggle. All I can really guarantee is that I will try to do better for y'all. One thing y'all can do for me is to help me grow this channel by liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing, and ringing that notification bell. The bigger audience I get here, the more time I can afford to devote to the channel, so you'd really be doing yourself a favor too. But with all of that out of the way, this is the moment a lot of you have been waiting for. This is the time when I review, all at once, a full 6 months worth of the horror movies from the HorrorPack subscription service. For those who may not know, HorrorPack is a monthly subscription service that sends 4 DVDs or Blu-rays of horror movies to your house every month. I subscribe to both packs, so I get all 8, and I've been unboxing them here on the channel. But at the time of those unboxings, I hadn't seen most of the movies. Now I have seen them, so I'm going to do a mass review of 6 months worth all at once. The way I do it is to offer some brief notes of review about each movie. Not a long, in-depth review because we'd be here for hours, but just a few words. And then I sort the movies into 3 rating categories. Here on my left, I'll stack up all the movies that really didn't quite do it for me. These correspond to maybe 1 or 2 star reviews. I'm not necessarily saying they're worthless trash or I completely hated them, but for whatever reason, I just didn't particularly care for them. Then, here in the center, I'll put the good movies. These correspond to 3 or 4 star reviews. They're not perfect, but I still enjoyed them and I do recommend them. These are the movies I liked. Finally, on my right, I'll put the great movies, corresponding to 4 to 5 star reviews. These are near perfect or transcendent films. These are the movies I loved. Usually, I'm not too hard to please, but I'm extraordinarily hard to blow away. So when I've done these mass reviews in the past, I've ended up putting the vast majority of the films into the good category, with fewer in the great category, and even fewer still in the bad category. In fact, let's start by quickly just noting where things stand from those previous reviews. So far, I've reviewed movies from the September 2020 through the August 2021 HorrorPacks, and we ended up with a grand total of just 20 movies in the lower rated, didn't care for it category, compared with no fewer than 50 in the middle, good, liked it category, and as many as 29 in the top, great, loved it group. So now, following the same rating scheme, let's look at all the movies I got from HorrorPack from September 2021 through February 2022. We begin with the September movies, and I should note as we get started that I'm discussing the DVDs first, followed by the Blu-rays, just to sort of keep things a little bit organized. The first of the DVDs was Death Day. To summarize this one, a girl is repeatedly murdered and resurrected. The script is just a little bit too disjointed, and the film looks not only low budget, but frankly a bit amateurish. However, the premise is strong enough that it probably would have been really good had it been given maybe another round of revisions. It's going into the lower rated category. Unfortunately, I don't really like to start off this way, but it's going into the lower rated category, reluctantly so. It's really kind of on the cusp between the middle and low categories, but the thing that pushes it down a little bit, even though I hate to start on this low note, is simply that now that some months have passed since I watched it, it's a bit of an effort to actually remember most of it. And if it's not memorable, I can't have liked it that much. So unfortunately, we're starting off with a low note and it's going into the lower didn't care for it category. Next is a film called Hellgirl. Herein, a team of fraudulent ghost hunters realize one of their own team members is connected to some sort of demonic activity. Though the fake ghost hunters meet real supernatural phenomena trope is very well explored, the characters in this one are quite well portrayed, and their relationships are interesting. The plot does try to go in too many directions all at once, and while each of the individual directions would have been interesting, the combination ends up being a little bit muddled. Still, it's well worth a watch, especially for someone like me who has a particular soft spot for movies about paranormal investigators. For those reasons, this will be our first entry into the good category. Next, we have Restricted Area. The story here follows some friends on a camping trip who end up squaring off against a murderous cult out in the woods. There are some pacing issues here. The film does a great job of building tension, but sometimes undoes its own great work of building tension by letting a few scenes drag on for a bit too long. However, the characters here are genuinely interesting and uniformly, I think, well acted, making it a bit of a breath of fresh air in the low-budget slasher subgenre. This one's also going into the middle category. And then we have The Scientist. This is about a scientist trying to save his terminally ill wife, and he performs some secret experiments in his garage and ends up creating zombies. It's a story we've all heard before, but what I really like about this one is that it doesn't just tell us the zombie origin story, but the entire movie is the zombie origin story. This is not about survivors fighting the undead, but rather about a man teetering on the edge between brilliance and insanity. But that's not to say it's without its problems. The acting in this isn't terrible, but given that it's not about zombie hordes, but rather about a man going insane enough to inadvertently create the zombie apocalypse, the acting really needs to be stronger. A character-driven story requires gravitas on the part of the actors, and that's just a bit lacking here. Plot-wise, I'm willing to suspend a lot of disbelief, but the institutional decisions that lead the main character to go rogue in the first place are fairly asinine, and I found them a bit distracting from what was otherwise a good movie. Unfortunately, this isn't the great movie it could have been, but it's nevertheless worth watching and also ends up in the middle category. And then moving on to the Blu-rays, we have one from Hammer called Wakewood. In this film, a grieving couple discover a dark ritual that can bring their dead child back to life for a limited time. Of course, this being a horror movie, things don't go well. This is actually a really good one. It reminds me a lot of Stephen King's Pet Sematary. It deals with a lot of similar themes and it has a similar emotional weight to it. Now, I'm not going to say this is as good as King's book, but it's definitely up there. For some reason, this movie never really got the audience it deserves, so you'd be well advised to check it out. And even though this isn't quite Pet Sematary quality, it's still good enough to be our first addition to the top category. Next, we have Killer Clowns from Outer Space. I doubt I really need to tell you what this is about. Most of you have probably seen it, and if you haven't, the title really tells you all you need to know. It's about killer clowns from outer space who turn people into cotton candy. But suffice it to say, it's a cult classic for a reason. It's far from fine cinema, of course, but it's the kind of zany, over-the-top horror comedy we all love. I really can't help but also put this in the top category. And here you'll notice that the top group isn't limited to just fine cinema. There's some highbrow stuff as well as some lowbrow stuff. I love it all. So to earn the top marks, a movie just needs to be among the best at what it does, whatever that may be. Moving along, we have Tremors: A Cold Day in Hell. This is a fairly recent Tremors sequel set not in the desert, but in the Arctic tundra, giving it a bit of a fresh setting. Kind of. Honestly, there's not a whole lot of frigid, snow-packed action, so it really just fits in with the rest of the Tremors movies without offering anything terribly new. The premise involves an Arctic setting, but it doesn't really seem like they had the budget to film it out in the middle of Arctic, snow-packed, middle of nowhere. But that doesn't mean it's bad. It's certainly not the best in the series, but if you're a fan of the series, as I am, you're not going to be disappointed by some of the over-the-top giant worm action in this movie. This one is also going into the good category. And then there's The Last Laugh. This movie follows a comedian on the night he's planning to give the stand-up performance that's going to launch his career to the next level. Unfortunately, it all goes to hell because there's a killer running around the comedy club. This is pretty standard slasher fare combined with a bit of a whodunit style mystery. But it's that mystery combined with fairly strong characterization that sets this one a bit above the rest of the pack. I was a bit disappointed that a movie centered on a stand-up comedian didn't have more comedy in it, so this is more of a straight horror movie than the horror comedy I was expecting, but I still quite liked it. More laughs might have pushed it into the top category, but as it is, it still goes into the good category. And then, between September and October, I also received my bonus movies. If you subscribe to either the DVD or Blu-ray packs a year at a time, you receive a bonus. Last year they were just included in my first pack, but this year they arrived separately, so I'm going to discuss them now. For the DVD bonus, I got Shadow Stalkers. This is a collection of no fewer than 10 horror movies. Let me read them out for you. We have Out of the Dark, Happy Birthday to Me, Eyes of Laura Mars, Don't Answer the Phone, Nightmare in Wax, Bloody Pit of Horror, Silent Night, Bloody Night, Funeral Home, Don't Open Till Christmas, and The Driller Killer. Now, some of these I already knew. Silent Night, Bloody Night, for instance. Others, like Bloody Pit of Horror, were entirely new to me. Overall, I think this is a pretty good collection of older and lesser-known horror movies. A few of them are from the 60s, but the bulk are from the 70s or 80s, and it's kind of fun to see the movies from that era that have been largely forgotten because they were overshadowed by the ones that have become cult classics. None of these are likely to become your favorite movies, but they're all at least worth a watch. I should say a word about Silent Night, Bloody Night in particular, because it's kind of the standout among the rest, and it's a bit controversial. There are those who say it's really a terrible movie that doesn't have much going for it. Others credit it as one of the major inspirations of the slasher genre that grew up in the years following its 1973 release. Personally, I think they're both correct. It's a deeply flawed film. The fact that its copyright wasn't properly processed, passing it into the public domain, seems somewhat indicative of the carelessness with which the entire production was assembled, and a lot of the film itself does seem sloppy and amateurish. However, it contains all the elements of greatness. It certainly inspired such later, and yes, superior, films as Bob Clark's Black Christmas in 1974, which in turn inspired John Carpenter's Halloween, which came out in 1978 and completely revolutionized horror cinema. All told, there are a couple of standouts and a couple of misses and a bunch in the middle of the road. So averaging it all together, this collection belongs also right in the middle of the pack in the good category. And then for the Blu-ray bonus, I got the Psycho Steelbook edition. Of course, everyone knows Psycho. It's a true classic not only of the horror genre, but of cinema in general. None of us can forget Alfred Hitchcock's mastery, particularly the shower scene that caught everyone off guard, or the truth about mother scene right near the end. I can't even really review a movie like this because it's such a classic, but I will say that this Steelbook edition is worthy of the film it presents, and I'd be an idiot if I didn't put this into the great category. Let's move on to October of 2021. This last HorrorPack was a bit controversial among HorrorPack subscribers because it didn't really have much to offer in terms of Halloween-related movies, and a lot of people were disappointed in that. And up to a point, I agree with them. I would have loved to get more of a themed pack, or at least a few more Halloween-related movies. Last year, the HorrorPack included one in particular called The Barn that I thought was exactly what a Halloween horror movie ought to be. So I was hoping to find another seasonal favorite. However, though we didn't get a load of Halloween movies, we did get some great movies anyway, so there's really no cause to be too upset. Those movies are... First, Don't Let Them In. This is a kind of home invasion story centered on a reformed criminal and his caseworkers trapped in a house when a horde of murderous strangers attack. I don't want to spoil too much, but I'll say that while it starts off like a fairly standard home invasion movie, it takes some unexpected turns which serve as both advantages and disadvantages. It certainly keeps you on the edge of your seat and keeps you guessing, but I don't think all of the twists quite worked. Nevertheless, good acting and interesting characters make this well worth a couple hours of your time, and it easily earns a place of honor in the good category. And then we have Beast Mode. This is a horror comedy about some Hollywood people that get their hands on some kind of elixir that turns people into what are essentially werewolves. Actually, calling it a horror comedy might even be a bit of a stretch, and it fits more within the comedy category, just with some horror themes thrown in. The production quality is quite impressive, it's very well put together, and it has an impressive cast, so it ought to be a good movie. Unfortunately, it just really didn't do it for me. Only a couple of the scenes really made me laugh, even a little bit, and since it emphasizes the comedy, it really needs to be funny. Of course, humor is subjective, and I could easily imagine this being a great film for someone with a different sense of humor from my own. But for me, it just didn't quite work, so unfortunately it's going into the lower category. Then there's Cleavers, Killer Clowns. I wasn't familiar with this movie before getting it in the HorrorPack, but I've since discovered that Killer Clowns is actually a sequel to a movie called Cleaver. I hadn't seen that movie before I watched this one, and I do think it loses a little something without seeing the first one first, as it does reference prior events. However, it's enough of a standalone film that you can still follow and understand the plot, even if you haven't seen the first one. And what you see is what you get here. It's a killer clown movie. If you like those, you're going to like this one. It's not the best of the subgenre, but certainly not the worst, and I found it was a fun way to spend a couple hours, which puts it in the middle grouping. Here we have Cupid. In this movie, Cupid is a kind of demon that, disillusioned with love, kills people. It takes place in a high school where a bullied student, similarly disillusioned with love, summons Cupid without realizing the bloodbath she's unleashing. What follows is the kind of over-the-top, cheesy fun one expects from a Cupid horror movie. I actually ended up liking it a lot more than I expected to, though. It does show its low-budget background, but it manages to be well put together within those constraints. The plot is a bit cliched, but it manages to work here. What really sets it above some other films, though, are the kills. Many of them are almost cartoonish, but they seem like exactly the kinds of things a demonic Cupid might do, and a couple of them even made me laugh out loud, but in a good way. It's not good enough to count as one of my absolute top picks, but I do recommend it. Good category for this one. And that's followed by Night Stalker. Those of you who follow the true crime genre undoubtedly know the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, who terrorized Southern California back in the 1980s. That's certainly good fodder for a horror movie, and that's what this is. It's basically a reenactment of several of the Ramirez murders. It does have a few good scenes, and the actors portraying the victims actually did a surprisingly good job compared to the quality of the rest of the movie. However, it's just not enough to make this a worthwhile film. It doesn't really have a plot or characterization or anything. None of those narrative features that we expect in a movie. It's just a few scenes inspired by those certainly not accurate representations of the true crimes. I was curious whether I was missing something or if everyone thought it was as bad as I thought it was, so I looked up some other reviews online. Pretty much everyone agrees with me, but reading the reviews was actually more entertaining than the film. Yikes. One reviewer on IMDb suggested turning it into a drinking game and taking a shot every time someone, usually Ramirez, says the word Satan. You'll be drunk in no time, but that's the only way this could be rendered watchable. I'm sad to say it because I do like true crime stories, but this just isn't one of the better ones, so it belongs in the lower category. Now, our next offering is not a single film, but this triple feature. It's called Triple Feature Horror Volume 2. And this comes with 3 movies: Scar, Terror Trap, and Midnight Movie. Scar is the story of a girl who escapes a crazy mortician who captures, tortures, and murders people, only to discover a copycat is on the loose years later. And it's actually a pretty good film. The torture isn't entirely original, but it's well done. One of the things the killer does is torture one person until that person tells him to kill their friend. So it plays a lot with the psychology of morality and self-preservation. The movie takes a few twists and turns that all work well, and overall I thought it was well done. Terror Trap is the story of a couple whose marriage is on the rocks. Their car breaks down and they find themselves staying at a motel. But the motel is run by maniacs and they're trapped by a bunch of people trying to kill them. I also quite liked this one. While watching it, it was thoroughly entertaining. Of the 3, it's the one that faded from memory the fastest, probably because it's the least original story, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It's also well produced, well performed, and quite good. Finally, Midnight Movie is about a midnight screening of a once lost and now recovered horror movie from the 1970s. Unfortunately, the killer from the movie comes to life and starts hunting the customers and staff of the theater. Yes, it's full of cliches, but that doesn't stop it from being a great movie to watch. The cast of characters are all pretty interesting and play really well against each other, and the horror is just wild enough to keep you on the edge of your seat. Overall, I don't know whether I'd put any one of the 3 into that elusive top-rated category on their own. They're all good, but maybe just not quite good enough to make it into that exclusive club, though it's actually a bit of a close call. However, because this managed to put 3 winners onto one disc, I have to bump it up into that top grouping just because of the amount of value it offers all in one package. So the triple feature also goes into the top category. Next we have Psycho Goreman, or PG. This is one of the ones I already had a copy of before getting the HorrorPack, so I already knew it was going to go into the top rated category, and it is. It's the story of a couple of young children who meet and gain the ability to command a sort of godlike intergalactic evil called Psycho Goreman. As the title would suggest, there's some great gore in here, but the whole thing feels like a bit of a throwback to some of the cheesy sci-fi horror from the 80s, and I love it for that. It's got some great violence, some great comedy, and most of all, it has a lot of heart. This is one you don't want to miss if you haven't already seen it. Another worthy entry for the top grouping. And then there's Why. Now this is pretty standard slasher movie fare. The main character isolates herself in a cabin only to be faced with a crazed killer on the loose. There's nothing terribly original about the premise, but if well done, it's something we can all enjoy, and it's pretty well done here. It does occasionally try to go in a few too many different directions, leaving us with a sort of disjointed feeling at a couple parts. The title suggests that maybe some of that was intentional, but if it was, it wasn't entirely successful. Despite some flaws though, I did enjoy Why. It's not the most memorable of the bunch, but it's easily good enough to go into the middle group. And then there's the November pack. The November of 2021 pack. The bridge between the haunting season of October and Halloween and the equally haunting, at least for me, season of December and Krampusnacht and Christmas. Fortunately, it was also a season for some good horror movies, so let's discuss. First, we have Axeman. Some people visit a cabin in the woods and are greeted by an axe-wielding slasher. And that's what the title promises, and it's what the movie delivers. There's really nothing terribly original about it at all. It's the standard slasher stuff. The characters are interesting enough that it's fun to watch them, even if many of them aren't particularly likable. And the plot, once it gets going, treats us to everything we've come to expect from a slasher movie. No more and no less. Brink Stevens does make an appearance, which will please a lot of the die-hard horror fans, but most of all, this is just a standard, mid-grade, run-of-the-mill slasher movie and an easy pick for the middle category. Next is Ghost in the Graveyard. A woman moves to a house where she's trying to unravel the secrets of her past. It's difficult for me to summarize beyond that because I don't want to give away too much, and the film does take a lot of twists and turns along the way to keep things suspenseful. What I will say is that it's not really very scary, but it is quite suspenseful throughout. Though some of the twists do strain the suspension of disbelief, I found it overall fairly successful, if far from perfect. This one seemed to divide audiences. Looking at some other reviews, it seems like people either gave it high marks or low marks, but no one really found it to be anywhere in the mid-range. I guess I'm the exception to the rule because I do put it into that middle, liked it but didn't love it category. And then there's 47 Hours to Live. The premise here is that people who play a smartphone game get cursed and they have 47 hours to live unless they convince someone else to play the game, thus passing the curse along. I was actually pleasantly surprised by it. If you think it sounds like somebody mashed together the plots of The Ring and It Follows, you're not at all wrong. That's exactly what this movie is. And it could have easily been a terrible, low-rent version of both of those excellent movies. I'll admit, it doesn't quite live up to either of them, but it's actually surprisingly good and ends surprisingly strong. So I'm happy with it overall. If I could rate the ending alone, it might even edge toward the top category, but judging the entire film, it belongs right here in the middle. Next, we have The Girl in the Mirror. When a girl moves to a new home, she discovers that the antique mirror in the basement holds a ghost. I'll be the first to say this one isn't gonna rock your world, but it is good enough to merit a watch. It's well made and stays within the limits of its budget, which is important, and it actually manages to go in a couple unexpected directions. However, I don't think its story quite merited a feature-length film, so parts of it seem a bit unnecessarily stretched out and a little too long. But if you make it through those parts, you'll find a story that you'll enjoy. This one also goes into the I liked it group. Then we have Argento's Dracula 3D. This is pretty much what the title says. It's the story of Dracula as retold in Dario Argento's style. If you like Argento's work, I think you're going to be pleased with it, even if it is far from his masterpiece. It does stray pretty far from Stoker's novel, and in fact it seems to have more in common with the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula film from back in the 90s than with the source material. But that really doesn't stand in its way. That vision of Dracula works quite well with Argento's style. I don't know if it's really anything to write home about for most people, but if you like 3D movies or if you're an Argento fan, you won't want to miss it. Another one for the middle category. Then we have the drive-in double feature. This is a double feature including Sky Sharks and Bunny the Killer Thing. First up is Sky Sharks, and this is truly a work of art. Sometimes you want fine cinema, and sometimes you want cheesy shark violence. When you're in the mood for the latter, Sky Sharks is the movie for you. If you liked Sharknado, this one's even more over the top, because it's not just about flying sharks. Oh no, this movie is about not see zombies who ride flying sharks. I think that's enough said, really. If that's what you want to watch, you're going to love Sky Sharks. And then we have a truly bizarre movie called Bunny the Killer Thing. I really don't quite know what to make of this movie, but it certainly fits in with the tone established by the other one. This movie is about a giant anthropomorphic horny murder rabbit, which is really just a guy in a bunny onesie with an oversized, organ. It's the kind of over-the-top, zany movie that I often enjoy, though I have to admit the trailers for this one give away most of the best scenes. However, if you like what you see in those trailers, I think you'll enjoy the movie. Altogether, I'm putting this into my top-rated category. I liked both of them. Sky Sharks is a bit better, and that's probably what really pulls the set into the higher grouping, but they're both a lot of fun to watch. You have to have a bit of a sick and twisted sense of humor for these, but I do have such a sense of humor, and I suspect a lot of y'all do as well. The next one is Deathcember. This isn't actually a movie, but a collection of short films. Specifically, it's an advent calendar. There's one short horror movie for each day in the month of December leading up to Christmas. I quite like holiday horror movies, and a lot of these shorts are really good. To be sure, they're a mixed bag, and some of them are better than others, as we would expect, but even the weaker ones are enjoyable for their short duration. Don't watch this all in one sitting, though. Watch it as it was intended, treating yourself to a little nugget of horror every day during the month of December, and you'll have a great time with it. Another one headed into that transcendent top group. And then there's The Last Thanksgiving. This is a slasher flick about a family who murder people that don't keep appropriate Thanksgiving traditions. As I said a minute ago, I like holiday horror movies quite a bit. However, they still have to be of a certain quality. This one is going to go into the middle category, but it's hanging just on the edge of the lower category. It does have some things going for it. One thing I like is that as the plot develops, it focuses more and more on Thanksgiving specifically, rather than the holiday being sort of incidental to the plot, as is sometimes the case with these kinds of movies. However, by the end, it takes a twist that I just didn't find satisfying at all, and that actually cost it quite a few points in my book. Ultimately, I'd say it is worth watching around the Thanksgiving holiday, and you'll probably enjoy that first viewing well enough, but I'm not sure that you're likely to want to return to it or make it a holiday tradition for your family. The same movie without the Thanksgiving element might have gone into the lower category, but because we need more Thanksgiving horror movies, I'm a bit more forgiving and putting it into the middle. That brings us to December of 2021, the month of joy, celebration, togetherness, the season of peace on earth and goodwill to men, and also a good time to watch foolish teenagers get hacked apart by lunatics, am I right? If you agree, you'll probably like these offerings, beginning with Sparrow. This is exactly the same as pretty much every other slasher movie out there. Some kids camping in the woods run into a killer. Shenanigans ensue. The advantage is that it's a formula that works, so you're not going to hate it. The disadvantage, of course, is that it is a formula, and Sparrow doesn't really add anything. And I do mean it doesn't add much of anything to the genre. I liked it well enough while I was watching it, but I actually had to go back and remind myself of it a little bit before filming this because it rapidly faded from memory. If you come across it, you're not going to hate it, it's worth watching, but I don't know that it's one to specifically seek out. Sparrow also belongs in the middle category. Then we have The Devil's Revenge. This is a film about a guy who finds an evil relic, and he ends up having visions and ultimately returns to a cave in order to destroy the relic and save his family from demonic forces. There's more going on beneath the surface that I won't go into to avoid spoilers, but that's sort of enough to give you the gist of it. In terms of quality, I honestly don't know what to make of this. On the one hand, it's a micro-budget and somewhat amateurish film with severe pacing issues. On the other hand, it's kind of a nostalgic reminder of the over-the-top horror films of yesteryear. What really makes it worthwhile is that none other than William Shatner has a role in the movie, which must have cost the bulk of the budget, judging by some of the film's other qualities. He's underutilized for sure, as his scenes are actually the best ones in the movie, but it's just so much fun to see him in this kind of movie that I can't help but enjoy it, despite its other flaws. Shatner really seems to understand what the fans want, and his presence guarantees it a place in the middle category, though the rest of the film might be on the cusp of middle to low. Next up, we have Sick, Survive the Night. This takes place during an ongoing zombie apocalypse and follows a scientist trying to cure the virus. While on a sort of field trip out into the apocalyptic wasteland, she ends up holed up with some other survivors and trying to, as the title says, survive the night. I'd say this is one mostly just for the hardcore zombie fans. It's refreshing in that it doesn't just look exactly the same as all the other zombie movies, but that doesn't mean it's entirely successful. The beginning and middle lag a bit, treating us to more of a drama than a horror movie, but it ends surprisingly strong. I'm pretty hard to surprise when it comes to horror movies, but I didn't actually see the ending coming, and it managed to recapture my fading attention in the final act, earning it a place in my liked it category. And then there's Doom's Chapel Horror. This is a film about a man returning to his hometown seeking revenge against a crazy sort of cult leader. That's about all I knew going into it, and it was enough to pique my interest, but I really wasn't sure what to expect. Whatever I was expecting, it certainly wasn't what the movie actually delivered. This is a found footage movie, and it really takes its time. If you like a slow burn, this is going to be the movie for you, because it spends a lot of time building and establishing the relationships between characters. But it's done in an interesting way. One likes and dislikes the right characters pretty much immediately, and their stories are interesting on their own. By the time the film's actual horror manifests itself, and I won't spoil exactly what that horror is, we're already invested in the characters. So the film layers the sort of mundane relational horrors with the horror movie kinds of horrors in a really productive way. It doesn't quite make it into my top category because I think it might actually be a little too slow getting off the ground, and some of its low budget nature shows through just a little too much. But overall, I do recommend the Doom's Chapel Horror strongly enough to place it in the good category. Next is Scare Package. This is an anthology film featuring a few short films connected by an overarching framing narrative. Or actually, a couple framing narratives. That's what's interesting about this, because the films sort of start to run together in a really interesting way. The short films themselves are a fun watch, but it's the whole package that really makes this one shine. It may get a bit convoluted, but it somehow manages to work as something that's just a lot of fun to watch. And all the better, this Blu-ray came with not only the film itself, but also the last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs episode featuring the movie. Anything Joe Bob does is always worth watching, so that alone would make this a great offering. But that the movie itself is also good instantly rockets it into the top grouping. And that's followed by Mayhem. A lot of people already know about this movie, but in case you don't, the whole thing is set inside an office building. The main character's gotten some trouble at work, he's had issues with his boss and co-workers, but because it's a horror movie, of course, a virus breaks out in the building that turns anyone infected into an ultra-violent maniac. They're all quarantined inside, and the resulting chaos is some of the best non-stop action I've seen in quite a while. It's well cast, well produced, and loads of fun to watch. I initially expected a 28 Days Later style zombie movie, which this is not, but it's even better because of its originality. It's been so hyped up by the fans that I do think it risks not living up to its own marketing, but it's an excellent film nonetheless and earns a top I loved it rating. And then there's The Shed. The premise here is that a vampire takes refuge in someone's shed to shelter from the sunlight. Said vampire gets trapped inside, giving the bullied teen living in the house to which the shed belongs an opportunity to seek revenge against those who've wronged him. That sounds like a setup for a particular kind of movie, and this does have all of those expected elements, but it actually ends up being not just an over-the-top romp, but actually a really good movie in terms of its plot, characters, and development along the way. It caught me a little by surprise. It does falter in places and sometimes tries to go in too many directions all at once, so it's not perfect, but it does manage to reunite all those threads by the end. If you're looking for a vampire movie that has real nasty vampires rather than the sparkly vampire romance crap we've all seen too much of, this is going to be the movie for you. It belongs in the middle category, but easily at the higher end of that category. And the final offering from this pack is Pool Party Massacre. The title tells you what this is. It's a bunch of kids having a pool party while being hunted by a slasher. You know what you're getting just as soon as you know the title, and it's exactly what it needs to be. The characters are mostly, let's say, mildly unlikable, although dutifully attractive in their various states of undress, making their inevitable deaths a sort of cathartic experience for the viewer. The deaths themselves involve a few creative kills, and the whole thing seems familiar but enjoyable. It does, however, take some unexpected turns. One in particular caught me off guard, and I do like when an otherwise formulaic movie manages to surprise me just a bit. If you're a fan of movies like Slumber Party Massacre or Babysitter Massacre, as I am, this fits right in with that subgenre and you won't be disappointed at all. It's far from fine cinema, but it's so good at being what it set out to be that it also earns a top rating. Moving along to January of 2022. January offers us all the promise of the new year. And since both 2020 and 2021 turned out to be complete dumpster fires of years, I was more than happy to welcome 2022 the right way. And the right way, of course, means I welcomed the year by watching horror movies like the following. The first out of the January pack is No Such Thing as Monsters. A young couple go into the woods for a vacation. Unfortunately, they run into a bizarre murder family who kidnap them and hold them prisoner to use them for their own ends. It feels a lot like Texas Chainsaw or Wrong Turn, but has just enough original elements to keep audiences entertained throughout. I'm not going to say it's a new favorite or anything, but it's remarkably well put together for a low-budget film, and I think people who like the murder family subgenre will find a lot to like here. This one is pretty easy to assign to the good grouping. Next is Backroad. The description on this one tells us we're going to follow the story of Jasper, who sounds like a troubled man. Well, he's a lot more than troubled. And it tells us we're going to be treated to the revelation of a dark family secret of biblical proportions. That is overstating things a bit. The reality here is that this is a decent movie, but not a great one. The characters aren't particularly likable, but that's intentional, and they are well performed. The script meanders a bit, but ultimately finds its destination. It's just that the payoff isn't really up to those biblical proportions we're promised. It's a worthwhile watch, but won't really get under your skin, so it goes into the middle-of-the-road category. I did like it, but I didn't love it. I even toyed with putting it on the bottom tier because the ending really didn't work for me, but there are some earlier scenes that redeem it just enough to hoist it into the middle. Next is Dead of the Night. This is a found footage movie about a team of ghost hunters spending the night locked in a supposedly haunted building to film their TV show. Y'all know I love that setup for a horror movie. It's right up my alley. And with Tony Todd on the cover, it should be a great movie, right? Well, that's actually a bit deceptive because Tony Todd only plays a bit role in this movie and really has very little to do with everything that actually transpires in the story. However, the story does go in a couple directions I didn't expect, and it ends up being a worthwhile movie, even if it's not at all what I was expecting. It goes into that good but not great category as well. Just be warned that it's not what you think it is, so that you won't be disappointed by what it actually is. Next is Encounter. A man and his wife move into the country to study orbs, which I talked about already when I opened this pack up. But as the story progresses, some real evil seems to be manifest in the new house. And in fact, it's not centered on orb nonsense like I was afraid it was going to be. This is another one that caught me off guard. It starts off exactly as I expected it to. It was well made, but nothing to write home about. However, it takes some twists and turns, and I didn't predict them, and that was enough to make it really quite a fun watch. It'll keep you guessing throughout, and that earns it a good rating. And that's followed by Prevenge. This is a sort of evil baby movie. Or I guess I should say it's an evil fetus movie, because it centers on a woman whose unborn child convinces her to do unspeakable things. It's an intriguing idea, but I think the film never quite decided what it wanted to be. It has the feeling like it's trying to be more of a horror comedy rather than a straight horror movie, though it never really made me laugh. And the pacing of the whole thing didn't feel quite right to me either. Still, it's got a good premise and a few good scenes, so I didn't hate it, but I struggled to decide whether to place it into the middle or lower category. But when in doubt, I try to err on the side of the middle rating as opposed to either the top or bottom ratings, so this one benefits from that calculus and lands in the good category. The next one is The Dark and the Wicked. The premise here, and I don't want to give away too much, is that a father is dying, and so the children come to visit him and to support their mother through the trying time. But they quickly realize that something's gone horribly wrong with their parents. Their mother is acting strange in a way that's, let's say, more extreme than can be explained just by grief or by exhaustion. And the story takes off from there. It treats us to some genuinely creepy scenes, but mostly it's a slow burn, character-driven tale. A lot of what makes it really good is that it plays a lot with the line between belief and skepticism, which is fertile ground for a horror movie. But it's not done as ham-fistedly as a lot of horror movies do. It's actually a fairly deep and honest treatment of the subject, which I love. It is a bit of a slow burn, but in the best of ways. It's from Brian Bertino, who wrote and directed The Strangers. So if you've seen that movie, you know you're in for a rich, atmospheric kind of storytelling, and that's on full display here. But when it all finally does come together in the final act, I was completely sold, and this ends up making it easily into the I loved it category. And then we have Puppet Master: The Littlest Reich. This is a Puppet Master movie. That's all you really need to know about the plot. It's about Nazi puppets that kill people. But it's also surprisingly good. We all know the Puppet Master movies have varied pretty widely in their quality. Franchises that last this long inevitably have some stinkers, and often the worst ones are the more recent ones, just desperately trying to squeeze the last drops of profit out of an already exhausted idea. That's not the case here, I'm pleasantly surprised to report. It's a bit of a reinvention of the franchise, remaining true to the spirit of its predecessors while also being self-aware enough to poke fun at itself in all the right ways. Overall, though, it's actually a great movie. The characters are interesting and mostly likable, the kills are good, and it really ticks all the boxes of what a great Puppet Master movie should be. This one is a real winner and goes into my top grouping, surprisingly so. And then there's Bad Dreams, the Best of Nightmares Film Festival 2021. This is a compilation of short films from the Nightmares Film Festival in 2021, just as the title suggests. I actually want to see more of these kinds of anthologies. There's a lot of great horror out there that excels in the short form, whether we're talking about short stories or short films. These are ideas that make for truly terrifying scenes or moments, but would be bogged down by the length of a feature film or a novel. So I'd love to see more of these kinds of projects finding an audience. This particular collection, of course, has both hits and misses, as any collection would. In total, it has 10 films, the vast majority of which are good to great. One of them, a film called Wreck Law, also includes an audio commentary track. But the real runaway hit of the bunch is a strange little film called My Dinner with Werner. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to have a blind date with Werner Herzog interrupted by Klaus Kinski, look no further. It's over the top and laugh out loud funny, whereas the other films are more straight horror movies, but the whole collection is excellent, and this also makes it into that top category. And then there's February, the shortest month of the year and our final stop on this journey of horror. But while it might have had fewer days, it had just as many great horror movies, beginning with Evil Takes Root, The Curse of the Batty Bat. The Batty Bat is a kind of tree-dwelling vengeful demon in Filipino folklore. This movie takes that monster and wraps a horror movie around it. Honestly, a lot of its tropes are fairly familiar, though well executed. But what I particularly like here is that it's not just another ghost, zombie, or vampire movie. Instead, it takes a monster that, though known in folklore, isn't very well known in horror cinema, at least as far as I know within the English-speaking world. And it turns that into something that works really well for a horror movie. It's not quite a new favorite, but it's easily worth watching, and it goes into the good category. That's followed by The Night Sitter. The lead character in this is a con artist posing as a babysitter so she can get into a house in order to rob them. While she's there, the child she's watching accidentally unleashes some evil witches, causing, well, a lot of mayhem. This is another really good one. It's certainly low budget and a little on the campy side, but it's reminiscent of some of the campy movies we all grew up watching, so it has some nostalgic elements to it. What I really liked, though, was the dynamic between the lead con artist babysitter and the kid she's supposed to be watching, which adds a lot of charm to an already good movie. This one also belongs in the good category. Then we have another triple feature. This is the Midnight Horror Collection featuring Killjoy 1, 2, and 3. The Killjoy movies are about a demonic killer clown named Killjoy, and they're of quite mixed value. The first movie is, let's say, far from good. It's amateurish in many ways, and Killjoy simply doesn't compare to some of the other famous killer clowns that we all know and love. I'm thinking of Pennywise or Art the Clown. But there is a certain charm to the film that I just can't quite put my finger on, and clearly somebody agreed because it managed to spawn a whole franchise. Killjoy 2 feels like more of a polished movie than the first one, but in the process it manages to lose whatever mojo made Killjoy memorable in the first movie. It seems like just another slasher movie rather than a Killjoy movie. But it's Killjoy 3 where things really took off. This movie still feels like a Killjoy movie, but also a more polished one. More importantly, it introduces all of Killjoy's demonic clown sidekicks, creating a lot of humorous byplay between all these characters and cementing the franchise in the horror comedy rather than straight horror genre. Overall, I'm happy with the collection. None of them belong in the top category, and one might question whether some might even belong in the lower category. But overall, the collection does what it needs to do and provides a lot of good horror value, so it belongs also in the middle category. And then Dark Encounter. This is part alien story and part missing child story. As the story goes on, the aliens end up providing answers to the mystery of the missing child. That is more of the story than I'd normally want to give away, but I don't really count it as a spoiler because it says so right on the back of the package. This is a weird one to classify. It's very well put together, and though it starts a little slow, the characters are interesting enough to carry the story until the action picks up. However, it doesn't really work as a horror story for me. It's more like a sci-fi thriller. So while it's good, it isn't quite what I was looking for when I chose to watch it. But I do think a lot of people will end up liking it, so I put it in the good pile as well. Next up is The Vigil. This is the story of a young Jewish man who gets hired to keep vigil over a dead body, in keeping with Jewish tradition. But while he's there, things take a turn to the creepy, and something that seems like ghostly or demonic activity begins to occur. This was actually one of my honorable mentions for Best Horror Movie of 2021, so I had seen it before I got my copy in the HorrorPack, but I'd only seen it on a streaming service, so I was thrilled to get the Blu-ray. And my rating stands. It's an excellent film. It makes great use of its atmosphere to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and I think that often makes for the best kind of horror movie. You really want to watch this one, and it goes straight to the I loved it category. Next is Mary. When a man buys a boat, his family goes out to sea. But there seems to be something evil out there with them, and they quickly find themselves turning against each other. The description of this one makes it sound like the perfect film for me. I like nautical horror, for reasons I've discussed on this channel before. And it's impressively cast with Gary Oldman in the lead. And a lot of it does live up to expectations. The acting is great, the production value is great, and I like the presentation of the nautical setting. But it also falters a bit. As much as it has going for it, it never quite transcends the cliches of the haunted house story, and its setting isn't quite enough to make it stand out. It's still a good film, and it does go into the good category. It just wasn't quite as great as it had the potential to be. And that brings us to Another Wolf Cop. This one is a sequel to a film called Wolf Cop, which wasn't included in the HorrorPack. I decided to watch that one first, and I'm glad I did, because you don't really want to start with the sequel in this case. And it's pretty much what the title says. It's about a police officer named Lou Garou. Yes, really. And he becomes a werewolf. We don't expect a great movie, but it does have all of the over-the-top comedy action and gore we want, and it's a really good watch. The sequel, surprisingly enough, might even surpass the original, because it can just skip straight to all the antics and gore without the burden of setting up the premise. I can't quite bring myself to put this into the top category, although it is tempting to do so, but it fits easily at the high end of the good category. And that brings us to Morbid Colors. In this movie, an already troubled girl seems to become infected with vampirism. So she and her sister go on the road to try to reverse the affliction. If you go into this looking for a vampire story, you're probably going to be disappointed. There is an element of vampirism in it, but we actually spend more time wondering whether the vampires are real or whether the affliction is just the product of the lead character's drug-addled mind. That's an interesting story in and of itself, though, and if that's the kind of film you want, you're going to like this one. It's a road trip story and a tale of dysfunctional families far more than it is a story about vampires. I recommend it, but as dark as it is, and it is dark, I honestly found it more of a family drama than a horror movie. But it's still a good watch and still earns a spot on the good list. And that does it. That's all of the HorrorPack offerings from the DVD and Blu-ray packs from September 2021 through February of 2022. It's true that I've already received and opened the March movies, and you can watch that video if you want, but that's just because this video took longer than expected to get around to filming. I've decided to hold off on reviewing those until I do my next mass review after I receive the August packs. So be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss that a few months down the road. So let's go ahead and tally up all of the totals. We have 1, 2, 3. Okay, in this 6-month batch, I managed to find only 3 that ended up in the low category, which is great, and actually a bit surprising. While I've been a strong fan of the HorrorPack movies as a whole, I would have expected a few more that didn't work for me. Either they had a really excellent 6 months, or maybe I've just been uncharacteristically generous this time around. Probably a little of both. The vast majority, as expected, are in the good category, consisting of ones I liked but didn't find quite transcendentally great enough to merit the upper rating. In the middle group, there were no fewer than 33 movies, which is wonderful. And finally, the top grouping of the best included as many as 14 truly excellent films. So I think that's yet another ringing endorsement for the HorrorPack service. And I should point out, this isn't a sponsored video or anything like that. I'm not paid to say so, I just believe in what HorrorPack is doing. Adding these numbers to the totals from the previous year, we find grand totals of only 23 lower rated movies, a whopping 83 in the middle or good category, and an impressive 43 in the top category. That's a lot of really great horror I've watched over the last year and a half, which I'm sure has just made me even more sick, twisted, and awesome than I already was. Now that we're finally done with the mass review, it's time for me to sign off. Be sure to stick around, as there will be more HorrorPack unboxing and reviews to come, along with plenty of other horror-related content. I'll be doing some more deep dives into horror books, movies, and theory, covering some genre news, and doing everything I can to make the world just a little bit creepier. I should also point out that next month, May of 2022, I'll be attending StokerCon and the Bram Stoker Awards Banquet. So if anyone watching is also planning to attend, you should drop me a line and I'll join you for an overpriced drink in the hotel bar. And now, all that remains is for me to say, as I always do, take care and stay scared.